My wife, a former children's librarian, is service leader with me, and she always gets to do the story. Today she's teaching owls, so I get to do the story. Cindy, who has written many excellent books. This is Good Night, Racism. Pay attention to the art. It is lovely art. Outside the window, peeking down from the night sky, the moon watches over us. Hey, switch change. All right, I'm not going to mock Amy anymore. This isn't as easy as it looks. She sees kids smiling at dinner tables and yawning in their beds. But some kids do not have food, do not have beds because of unfair rules and unjust treatment. The moon sees all kids, whoever they are, wherever they are, and shines her light on them. The moon wants her light to kiss every child goodnight. The moon delights when every child falls asleep. Because the moon knows when we sleep, we dream. When we dream, we imagine what is possible, what the world can be. And the moon glows a little brighter, whispering, "Dream, my child. Imagine, my child. A new world, a new future awaits. A world where all people are safe, no matter how they look, how they worship, or how they love. A world where all kids have the same chance to have peace, to have joy, to have a childhood. A world where all people breathe fresh air and have what they need to feed their minds and bodies. A world where our rules open doors, open minds, and create equity and justice for all. Dream, my child. Create, my child. A new world, a new future awaits. Good night, unfair rules. Good night, cruelty. Good night, injustice. Good night, inequality. Good night, hate. Good night, hurt. Good night, racism. Good night. Evil. I'm against it. I mean, we're all against it, aren't we? Aren't we? Yep. Okay, that was harder than I was hoping. And yet, look around. There it is. Somebody should do something about that. But I am not going to fix evil here today. Sorry, I haven't taken that particular class in seminary just yet, but I do promise that as soon as it is offered, I will enroll. What I'm going to try to do here today is figure out one way that we can, that we should think about one particular way that evil shows up in the world. Oppressive suffering. Suffering like racism, or sexism, or homophobia, or transphobia, caused by people to other people on a grand scale. And persuade you that without a realistic theology of evil, of injustice, of sin, we, Unitarian Universalists, cannot have a meaningful theology of love and justice. Now look, I know you're UUs. You aren't necessarily super comfortable with words like theology. I mean, isn't that God talk, Chad? Well, yeah, it can be. But it isn't just that. Not for me, and I don't think it needs to be for Unitarian Universalists. We are a faith that affirms the reality that we all live, exist, coexist in an interdependent web of existence. The reality, that reality can be beautiful and it can be brutal. It is both. And theology is the struggle with what it means to be human in that web. Now, I was pointed down this road, this strand of that web, by William R. Jones, a Unitarian minister and African-American humanist, who in 1973 sought within the black Christian community a theology of black liberation that could account for the suffering of African slaves and the continued oppression of their descendants in America. Racism, white supremacy. Any such theology, he argued, must start with the question of theodicy. Now, theodicy is just a fancy seminary word. I thought I got rid of all the fancy words when I left law, but it turns out seminary's full of them. And theodicy is a fancy seminary word for the question, how can God allow evil and suffering? For black liberation theology, Jones tweaked the question a bit, and he asked, is God a white racist? It's the title of his book. And for him, any viable, reasonable theodicy had to refute the charge of divine racism. And he believed that that had to be a starting point for any black liberation theology. And make no mistake, he wanted the answer to his question to be no. I'm not going to answer his question here today. I'm not sure that I, a white man in 2024, am the audience Jones had in mind when he wrote his book 50 years ago. And I'm not going to jump into the debate over black Christian liberation theology because I am not black, no kidding, or a Christian. Still, reading Jones did spark a question, one he didn't ask, but I think maybe I, a white man in 2024, should. A theologian of black liberation must, Jones wrote, demonstrate that black suffering is not the will of God, or else the oppressed will not regard their suffering as oppressive and will not be motivated to attack it. The oppressed will not regard their suffering as oppressive, he wrote. And I stopped, and I wondered, okay, but what about the oppressors? Shouldn't they see the suffering as oppressive and be motivated to attack it? Shouldn't we? And I want to be clear here about who I mean by we. I mean the privileged classes in this culture. The people Reverend Robinson from the opening reading, trust your own writing, Chad. The people Reverend Robinson was talking about in this morning's reading, who by virtue of accident of birth or other circumstances have good jobs, good educational background, and good lives. The people with power, even if that power is sometimes, often, only relative. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, me. And people who have the kinds of culturally embedded privileges that I do. Demographically speaking, I mean a lot of Unitarian Universalists. So shouldn't we have a theology that accounts for oppressive suffering and why it exists? Now, Jones, I think, would say, we already do. Whether we like it or not, whether we're aware of it or not, we have that theodicy, that theology. He said everyone has what he called a functional theodicy, some understanding of whether the suffering we see in the world should just be endured or should be annihilated, of what causes it, of whether it can be eliminated or whether it is an inevitable part of the human condition. The question isn't, do we have that? The question is, the theodicy that we have we given it any serious thought? Or have we just settled into it by default? And if we have, is it the one we want? As James Luther Adams, the great Unitarian theologian, wrote, an unexamined faith can only be right by accident. I'm not willing to trust the accident. So I want us to examine our theodicy. And like Jones, I believe that examination should be the launching point for our own theology of liberation. A theology that acknowledges our roles in and power to change the oppressive suffering that persists, even though we all, just a few minutes ago, agreed on the bold stance that we are firmly anti-evil. How do we get to that theology? Well, let's start by recognizing that we're answering a slightly different question than Jones was. Jones kept coming back to one recurring challenge through his book. Christian liberation theology starts from an assumption that God is good, benevolent. At the center of Christian liberation theology is the idea of God's preferential option for the poor and oppressed. And so Christian liberation theology has to figure out how oppressive suffering is permitted by that loving God. That was the challenge Jones laid before black liberationists. We don't face exactly the same challenge. UUs have many beliefs about God, but few, if any of us, believe God is pulling the strings. We do not see God revealed in human history. We see ourselves. And so our theodicy question is not, is God good and righteous? The question is, are we? And the answer, my friends, is unsatisfying. Our theodicy, if examined honestly, tells us oppressive suffering exists and persists because human beings sometimes do or choose to do nothing about terrible things. It is not God that permits suffering and oppression. It is us. We commit evil. We sin. We build whole systems to give sin inertia. Okay. That's depressing. But that depressing and difficult answer to that difficult question is, I want you to remember, just our starting point. It is not the end of our theology if we let ourselves stop there. Our theology is worse than worthless. It is harmful. It becomes an excuse, what Forrest Church called the sin of sophisticated resignation. People suck. What are you going to do about it? What's on Netflix? But we're not building a theology of rationalization. We seek a theology of liberation, a theology of action to reduce oppressive suffering, a theology that doesn't deny sin's presence among us, but also never forgets, as Paul wrote to the Romans, that where sin abounds, so too does grace. The capacity to change, to bridge the chasms formed by sins of oppression. So this theology that we need to build, I think it must do at least three things. I'm sure there's more. The first two I've already touched on. It has to call us to acknowledge the ongoing reality of oppressive suffering, and it has to call us to account for our roles in that suffering. And I just depressed you a second ago, so let me give you a little bit of what I think is good news. I'm going to give us some credit there. I think UUs are, though always imperfectly, starting to come to grips with those two pieces. At least to realize that we need to talk about them, to confront them, and to keep doing it. But the third element is harder. This theology must call and welcome us back into community when and if we are ready to atone for and try to do something about the suffering we've caused or tolerated. We need to be ready and willing to change, to do something to shift the inertia of sin. And we need to be ready and willing to welcome people back into community who we know have caused harm if they are truly ready to atone. The rubber has to meet the road. Now, as we, Unitarian Universalists, wrestle with how Article 2 of our bylaws should describe our faith and our shared values, I honestly struggle a bit with how we can keep the beautiful and potentially powerful notion of a theology centered in love from turning into something vapid. A theology of lowest common denominators. A theology of liberation, or maybe better, a theology of responsibility must be part of the answer to that. A new Article 2 language speaks of a spiritual discipline of love. That disciplined love has to be more than a fuzzy sense of love for all people, or even a deeply felt mourning for the oppressive suffering many people live with. It was a beautiful book, but reading Goodnight Racism in church is not spiritually disciplined love. Not if that's where we stop. A spiritually disciplined love has to be a love that does something. A spiritual discipline of love, a theology of responsibility, has to call us to see the whole of every person's humanity. See the suffering, yes, but don't define people by it. Don't romanticize or patronize. See the harm people cause, the harm we cause or tolerate. But don't retreat into self-flagellation or defensiveness or defeatism or unrelenting condemnation. We sang this morning the meditation on breathing. When I breathe in peace. When I breathe out love. Now, some Buddhists take a different approach to that prayer. Breathe in the hurt, the anger, the fear, the hate in the world, and seeing it for what it is, then breathe out love. When I breathe in pain. When I breathe out love. That asks a lot. There is so much pain. But a spiritually disciplined love is lived through a theology that holds enough faith to trust that we all, not us in this room, but all humanity, can face our deeply flawed and breaking humanity, our shortcomings, our inevitable screw-ups, and still see each other's inherent worthiness and dignity. This is what it means to be a universalist. To refuse to flinch away from our human limitations and flaws and sins, to remember that we each also have a human and holy capacity to do good, to speak truth, to create beauty. And a spiritually disciplined love calls us to do something that tries to do good, to speak truth, even when, especially when, it is frightening or uncomfortable. To draw out and take in the beauty in the world and in each other. To try, knowing we will not always succeed. Knowing sometimes we might even make things worse. And then to try again. Almost 4 years ago, in the days after George Floyd's murder, while Lake Street was burning, I sat on my couch in my house 10 miles away in northeast Minneapolis and tried to write a song. Maybe a prayer, since I never got around to putting it to music. It has the great line, I don't know what we need, but it's probably not another white guy with a guitar. And the refrain was, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how much I just don't know. To be honest, I still don't know. I'm still in that place in many ways. As much as I believe that we need some version of this theology I've laid out for you, I am chagrined, embarrassed to admit to you that I don't quite know what it means in practice. I mean, in the world. I know I am a white man living in a white man's world. I know that is unjust. And I am practically paralyzed by knowing that I don't know what to do about it. And I don't think I'm alone in that. But not knowing what to do isn't the same thing as not knowing there is work to be done. It cannot be an excuse to do nothing, to convince myself that there isn't anything I could do. That uncertainty is a reminder of one more thing this theology must do. It is a reminder that as a privileged class, in hard language, as the oppressors, we must approach our liberation theology with humility. It cannot be a theology of, here I come to save the day. A white savior theology. We've been down that road. It led us here. We don't want to be here. We're looking for a new road, a new route. And we should not assume that we know the way. All right, look, if we're building this particular theology for people who look like me, middle-aged white guys, let me put this in terms that my people understand. Stop gripping the wheel so tight, swallow our pride, pull over and admit we're lost. Ask for directions. Let someone else drive for a while. And don't sulk about it. It's hard. I know. Trust me, I know. But saying we're against evil, against injustice, that's just the easy part. We are way past time for the easy part. Our faith, the theology of love and responsibility we need to build together, calls us to do the hard work of living against evil together. So may it be. And may it be because we make it so.